My brain would be jumping to the way to reducing waste. And I read an article this week about society being obsessed with newness. And it's just driven sort of this consumerism, which we're all really used to. And, and it goes on every level. We're approaching Christmas, so there'll be new sofa and TV adverts because there seems to be, and I've never really understood this one, but this pull that for, at Christmas we have to have a new sofa and a new TV to have the family round.
That was Emma Richardson-Calladine, and this is the Bailiwick pod with me, James Filial. So COP26 is done. Climate change has had its week leading the news agenda. Now what happens next? Is it all blah blah blah, or are enough people now calling for lasting, meaningful change? Locally, we have the trade-off between carbon neutrality and net zero, and a focus on basically how much you use your car, how often you fly, and how you heat your home. For those of us who dutifully drive to Collette every weekend to do our recycling, yes, my parish of St Clement seems to be the last place in the island, perhaps the whole nation, which has no curbside facility. Where does recycling fit into it all? It's perhaps unbelievable that after all these years of recycling, we're still having the same old discussions about it. To fit all of that together, my guest on the pod today is Emma Richardson-Calladine, who was the recycling manager with the government for around 14 years, but has now moved into her own consultancy called Waving Back, focusing on sustainability. Emma, welcome to the pod. Do you feel recycling fell off the COP agenda in some ways?
That's a really interesting question, and I think there were lots of things that were relevant and that you can take away to apply to waste management, and you'll reduce, reuse and recycle. And that was all about the behaviour change, which was embedded throughout the COP. And what was really interesting was that looking at how all of the individual countries are making their action plans and taking that down from that sort of macro level down to individual level of what we all can do. And I think that's something that we can all play a part of, and that's relevant to the carbon neutral strategy in Jersey because that's very people powered, and it's about making those differences that we can all play a part in. And waste management is a really interesting topic to apply that to because we all generate rubbish. We all throw something in the bin, at least once a day, probably a lot more. And thinking about, there's so much we can think about that. From working in recycling for many years, when I started, it was really a decision about what bin do you throw something in. Is there a can bin when you finished a fizzy drink, as an example? But how that is changing now is recycling's, moving forward and becoming the norm. And I know it's still not the norm for everybody, but is being a big part of sort of normative behaviour nowadays. And the conversation has evolved, not from what bin do I throw it into, but actually, should I have generated this waste in the first place? So if we were talking maybe about a plastic bottle of water, actually not is there a plastic bottle bin for me, but actually why didn't I use a refillable bottle? And then looking at the wider supply chain, where can I refill that bottle once I've emptied it? I refilled it at home this morning. Where can I go for free refills? Are there organisations that are supporting that behaviour as part of their own social responsibility plans? And looking at sort of how that spans out like a spider web of the responsibilities, so that all of those things support each other. And that's when you end up with the real behaviour change. And what is frustrating, and I'm sort of fascinated with this positive behaviour change around sustainability, but actually the problems, and lots of the problems that they were talking about at the COP, were potential sort of shifting the issue from one thing to another, actually not still more work needs to be done around those behaviour change elements. So transport, is a big one for our carbon neutrality, but lots of people think electric vehicles are the solution. And for me, that's very frustrating because actually the behaviour isn't changing. People are running and swapping their diesel car for an electric car, but they're still not rethinking actually their transport needs and could they reduce that and have more sustainable transport solutions rather than still being an individual in an electric car stuck in a traffic jam of electric cars.
It's really interesting, isn't it? So it's kind of the behavioural change which is becoming more important than recycling specifically. So would you say that had kind of dropped down the priority list, the kind of direct act of recycling something?
I think so. It's all different parts of the journey all at once. So there are still lots of conversations that are topical around recycling, as still moving towards all 12 parishes having household recycling collections, and getting that basic recycling service to everyone's doorstep is really important. So definitely those conversations still fundamental. But looking actually at the bigger picture, the more important conversation is really around reducing waste. And then what waste we're left with, can we be reusing it, repurposing it? From looking at a business perspective, if you generate a waste, could that waste be someone else's resource? So an example is coffee grounds. My understanding is that mushrooms grow really well in coffee grounds. So, linking up businesses where one has that waste, one has that need for that, where it sees it as a valuable material, you've solved potentially a lot of that waste solution. That waste has almost disappeared. And then you're getting into talking about the circular economy, and this is really where someone else's waste is someone else's resource, and putting it back through that cycle. So you're really trying to design out waste, and I think this is where the real exciting conversations are happening. And you can probably tell in my voice that's much more exciting than actually saying, well, what bin shall I put my plastic bottle in? And I think for everybody, that's a lot more exciting, but that is a much bigger conversation and involves each step of the supply chain. So back to electric vehicles, lots of brilliant science innovation happening to try and solve the solutions that these last few generations have created, but it isn't solving everything. There's been lots of talk in the news recently around the batteries in electric vehicles, what happens to those? And that shouldn't be the end user's problem, or the local authority, the government's problem. Those people designing the things all up the supply chain need to have a responsibility throughout that cycle. But it is creating an issue for the future. And this, for me, is something that doesn't seem to be spoken about enough. And I'm really lucky to be working around sustainability. And for me, that means, that we live within, satisfy our needs without compromising the needs of the future generation. But if we're creating a product that generates a waste and we don't have a solution for that waste, we're relying on future generations to solve that problem for us. On one hand, it's really positive. We've got the faith and the science and in generations to come to be able to solve that problem. But equally, we're leaving a problem as a legacy, which sits quite uncomfortably with me within the context of sustainability. And relevant again to the COP, as Obama was talking, I think more targeted at young people, saying stay angry about climate change. And I think this is relevant to this, stay angry. I'm not saying angry protests or anything like that, but real sort of critical thinking, really challenging what's going on, because leaving a problem for the future wrapped up within sustainability, I think that flags up lots of questions.
So let's go into that in some more depth then, because we're talking about behaviour change ostensibly. So maybe the electric car example is a good one to pick up on that. So someone's driving a petrol or a diesel car at the moment. Would you encourage them within the next year or so to change out of that to an electric car? Or that's not a behaviour change that you really want them to take at the moment, because their petrol or diesel car could last for another 20 years. So there's a lot of waste created if they change that behaviour at the moment. So just give them some help around that decision.
Yeah, it's really, I would apply sort of the waste hierarchy, which I always working within waste management, and the 3 R's that I used to go into schools and talk about your reduce and reuse and recycle. And it's a bit bigger than that. It spans about making a responsible purchasing decision at the top of that pyramid. But then you get the maximum amount of life out of that product. The environmental and financial investment you've made, make that work really hard. And there's some local industries popping up that are repairing things, and obviously the charity sector do reuse really well. So if it is something you don't need anymore, or somebody else can get a really good use out of that. And then when it is at the end of its useful life, then let's look at recycling. And if it can't be recycled, then it is a waste. Behaviour change will be sort of governed within the parameters of sort of government policy. There will be that push to be working towards that sort of behaviour change. But really the bit that I'm interested in is not what type of car you drive, it's why are you in the car. Can there be some other sort of behaviour changes? So whether it is, the world has moved forward so much in the last 2 years, and people are talking more about hybrid working. So is there a case that you don't go into the office every day? So actually that has a transport benefit. You're not getting in the car. On the days you can, could you do something other than go in the car? And maybe, still working our way towards coming out of the pandemic, maybe it's not the right time to be talking about car sharing, but other sustainable ways of getting around. For me, my working sort of arrangements have changed so much from being in an office and on site every day to being at home and communicating, every day using all of the platforms that we're now used to and probably had never heard of 2 years ago. That is the norm. And so that does have an impact to our transport patterns. So there's definitely more. So I guess the transport equivalent of why are you in the car is what bin do I put this in? There's bigger conversations to have which have a much bigger impact.
Can I take you on to two other, but probably even thornier issues, which is heating in the home and flying? Obviously, as islanders, we fly very often. So it's quite hard to change behaviours there. I mean, obviously, you could change your boiler out. You could swap it for something other than a fossil fuel boiler. Big cost there, though, for families. That's an expense. And on the flying side, I mean, if you're going to go and see friends or families or work, it's always practical to not fly. So I just wonder what your comments there are around changing behaviours, because perhaps not quite so easy in those two areas.
No, I think there's, in regard to sort of heating the home, again, there's some behaviour change things. There's lots of information out there about the impact that actually dropping your heating a degree and the benefit actually that has. And it is quite amazing, the positive benefit that has of putting an extra jumper on or something, or putting your slippers on instead of walking around barefoot. And there's some things you can do within the home, and the brilliant thing about that, as well as the environmental benefit, is it saves you money. And I've done quite a bit of work around food waste. And again, the less you throw away, the more money you save. So there's a nice tangible benefit for people with the heating. I think there's some conversations around future developments and what type of heating is put in new homes and when homes are sort of renovated, and making that easier and more information out there, so that the old technologies which we don't want to be continuing to invest in on environmental grounds are slowly phased out. But there is a new norm, if you like, coming in that is supported. And as you buy a new home, you move to a new build, that becomes the norm. So I think there's some work to be done around there. With transport and more sort of further afield travel, it's a really interesting one, and I've done some work around sustainable tourism recently in the UK. And one of the conversations that we were having was around businesses helping their customers. So if it was sort of my family travelling from here to stay somewhere in the UK, that's the place I was staying in would be helping me calculate my carbon footprint. And one of the speakers was encouraging these business owners to have some carbon calculators and to encourage customers to calculate that as part of their booking process, and to be doing some offsetting. And again, lots of conversations to be had around offsetting. But there is some positive outcomes that can be generated, and there is some issues around making sure they're the right schemes and they do have a real positive benefit in the place that they're saying they do, and it's not sort of greenwash and it sounds great but actually doesn't achieve very much. So as long as it's genuine, then I think there is some means around that, because of course, more so than ever, we want to explore and see our loved ones. Of course we do. And the world's an exciting place to explore. But as well as thinking about the travel, then there is the flip side of sort of changing behaviour, but also recognising that the behaviour that you do follow through with has an environmental impact. So potentially, could we see in years to come, you've got the cost of travel, but included within that is some offsetting, which becomes the norm as part of our travel. If you do want to do something, there is a consequence, and that's a personal responsibility to help balance the books, if you like.
One of the factors which has been discussed a lot recently, both locally and internationally, I guess, after COP26, has been dates, targets 2030, 2050, 2080, or whatever, people are coming up with. Where do you stand on those dates? Because there has been made the argument that you make it more aggressive and you pull it further forward, you create waste. So do you think you need a target, or is it better to kind of gradually change people's behaviour and work with them and get them to do something over a longer period of time, rather than force them to do something artificially quickly?
I think it's a bit of both. I do think the targets really help focus the conversations. I think if you'd had, the world leaders around the tables with no target, would you see the outcomes that we did last weekend? And I'm doubtful. I think the dates are really important, but equally, you're exactly right. By forcing some things, you are generating a waste by forcing that behaviour change. But it is really interesting because climate change is a global issue. As much as you can have targets in Jersey, targets in the UK, targets wherever they are, and we're all working towards the same grand plan. But it is a global issue. And I'm doing some work with the University of Exeter, and they're focused on donut economics, which is sort of an environmental slant on economic models, and looking at economic models in terms of sustainability and growth captured within this donut so that it remains sustainable and changes the differences in society and global differences so that we are living on a more sustainable planet. And really interesting in a chapter that we were focusing on, there was a student from India, and the conversation was about sort of carbon accounting, I think, in whatever plan they had. And the student said that's not our priority. And I think that's what we've been seeing as well of the COP, of many places in the world really keen to grow their economies and improve their standard of living, but following the model that's gone before, that comes at a huge environmental cost. And there's so much work to be doing around that sustainable development, and supporting those countries grow, but sustainably, but equally not hindering their growth because of the mistakes that have established successful economies that have gone before them. So it's a huge topic. And I think, to go back to your question, yeah, absolutely, target's important. But you're right in highlighting that the sort of the almost artificial push that puts on behaviour change generates its own problems. And I don't have the answer to that, other than, I think we all need to recognise that there is potentially waste byproducts. And I guess where there is an opportunity is for people to identify where those new pockets of waste are, and to try and identify if those pockets of waste are a resource for something else, and be applying that circular economy model, which may be asking the impossible. But I'm sure there are items there that there are some really good opportunities, whether it's commercial or with the third sector or just small scale innovation. But we need to keep moving forwards.
What would, I mean, speaking moving forwards, what would you most like to see change first in Jersey? Is it as simple as recycling more than just plastic bottles? I mean, it's an obvious example which people come up with, it's only plastic bottles which are recycled, not other plastics. Milk cartons aren't recycling, all that, that's been in the news for quite a few years now. Glass, I understand we're crushing it, we're not going to be recycling glass for the next couple of years. What would you most like to change? Is it something like that? Or is it recycling more electricals, which we've touched on already? Or is it this kind of wider behaviour change? And if so, what? I just want to get down to that kind of specifics. If you had to say, right, in the next couple of years, that's what I think we should do first, where would your brain go? What would you say?
My brain would be jumping to reducing waste. And I read an article this week about society being obsessed with newness. And it's just driven sort of this consumerism, which we're all really used to, and and it goes on every level. We're approaching Christmas, so there'll be new sofa and TV adverts because there seems to be, and I've never really understood this one, but this pull that at Christmas we have to have a new sofa and a new TV to have the family round, and through the year you see these adverts sort of drip fed to support that buying behaviour. But do you really need a new sofa or a new TV? And it comes with that sort of the mentality that I think we've for many generations has been almost sort of fostered, and that you get the promotion, so I can afford the new car, or we can afford a bigger mortgage, and it's constantly then not only putting pressure on yourself to maintain that and increase that, but putting pressure on this newness and this buying more, so I would be focusing on waste reduction and that thinking, sort of rethinking our behaviour on, do we need this, and if we are buying this, let's make it the most sustainable choice we can. And thinking about, so fast fashion is within there, and done some work with schools around that, and absolutely it's brilliant. You can go and buy an outfit for, I don't know, we'll say the Halloween party, for whatever number of pounds it is, but there's some tonnages of how actually, how many tons of Halloween costumes end up in the rubbish every year. And textiles has got a massive environmental footprint. When you're thinking of the crops that are grown to generate the textiles in the first place, there's some element of plastics in there as well with our man-made fibres, but sort of right from growing a plant through to the clothes that we wear, massive environmental footprint. And food, I think it started off, I think when I started in recycling, being one bag in every three of food was wasted, and I think it's about 1 in 5 now. But still, we all have a rough idea of what a bag of shopping costs. And when you're throwing that much food waste in the bin, albeit sort of drip fed throughout the week or a couple of weeks, you've burnt, so you might as well have thrown sort of £20 in the bin, and none of us in our right mind are going to do that. So there's sort of financial saving as well as the environmental, but it's really rethinking that behaviour. And there's some lovely sort of social media posts going around at the moment, which have been sort of doing the rounds for a few years around Christmas shopping, and actually buying memories, so buying maybe theatre tickets or whatever it might be, instead of stuff. Let's try and buy less stuff. And I know there will be people that say, well, that puts the shops out of business, and that puts shop workers out of business. And but the economy will change. Businesses will change and evolve with this, as they are going to have to. There's been lots of different changes within the commercial sector, and I think those small changes not only will help save people money, and reduce environmental footprint, but I think there's lots of sort of health and well-being benefits around there. So instead of buying me a new candle, why not, but buy 2 tickets and we'll go to the theatre. And actually there's a really nice, memory around there that I can, it's just got a wider impact. So yeah, I would be focusing on that obsession with newness, and the behaviour change around reversing that.
Emma Richardson-Calladine, thanks for your time on the pod. So reduce, reuse, recycle. The mantra and the priority order still applies, even though net zero and carbon neutrality have made a late bid for Christmas number one. That's all from the pod this week. Remember, you can find it in all of the usual pod places and keep up to date with what's happening in Jersey every day with bailiwickexpress.com. The music you can hear incidentally at the beginning and about now is I Shift My Weight by Luno. Thanks for listening. Remember to like and share, it really helps, and there'll be more on the pod next week.